welcome to another episode of Latitude. And in this episode, we're looking at another major engagement that India's Prime Minister has had with the world's most wealthy nations, the G7. And what is interesting is that India has exhibited the rare capacity to engage both with the BRICS, which comprises of Russia and China, and soon thereafter to engage with the G7 nations, which earlier were G8 with Russia in it, but it's out for obvious reasons. And Mr. Modi was invited, especially by the German Chancellor, who was hosting the G7 summit, along with representatives from the countries such as Indonesia, South Africa, Senegal, and Argentina, kind of effort to give the global South a voice, as well as India would soon be emerging as the host of the G20 initiative, which is really the larger platform for countries that are not part of G7. And we have with us Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who has been in various important diplomatic assignments and is also a commentator on international affairs and has served both at the UN General Assembly and in the EU headquarters in Brussels. So he has a pretty good understanding of how the Western world and the affluent, rich West thinks in terms of a lot of issues that were discussed at this conference, which included matters such as food security, health, counterterrorism, gender equality, democracy, and of course, projects which would allow the world to counter China's expanding footprint. So Manjeev Puri, welcome on the show again, and delighted as usual to have your articulate presence amongst us. So what are your initial thoughts?
Maru, thank you very much. And I very much agree with you that this is part of what, if you don't mind my using an expression, which is perhaps a bit hackneyed, India's multi-alignment. You know, we are a unique country. Look, we are soon going to become the largest nation in the world. And I know that in India, people bemoan the idea of population. But think about being the largest country in the world in population terms. We are among the 5 largest economies in the world. Any grouping, rich, not so rich, emerging, anything, don't you think that grouping gets enriched if it includes India in it, or at least gets India's perspectives heard and perhaps gets India also to be part of it? Therefore, you know, Maruf, this has been going on for quite some time. And of course, as things progress, things go forward, and the Prime Minister is going there, in this time in person. And if you recall that the last time the G7 summit was held in England, he wasn't able to go, and it was done virtually because of the COVID pandemic itself. So Indian Prime Ministers have been invited to this G7 outreach now for many, many years. I think the first time was the year 2000. But this time there's something very interesting. One, China was not there. B, Russia, of course, from 2014, after the Crimean business, has been knocked out of the G7 from G8. So India's importance was relatively greater. Secondly, as you mentioned, while Indonesia hosts the G20 later this year, India hosts the G20 next year. So the idea of the G20, the G7 interface within that, as well as the Ukraine issue and our independent, let me say, multi-aligned aspects of that particular thing were particularly important. And I am therefore very much of the convinced view that this was something which the Western countries, the rich Western democratic countries, thought that they gained by having India. And from our perspective, we gained by being part of them and being part of this thing. A good augury in my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very well put. And it's really clearly becoming a win-win situation for both. And you can't keep India out of the room anymore, although the shadow of China is always in the room. And I'll come to that a bit later. In fact, Mr. Biden apparently was urging everyone and the flock of G7 to stay together at a time like this, when the G7 leaders are finding it increasingly difficult to continue to echo the American position against Russia, despite the sanctions, despite the ongoing conflict, and despite Russia bombing Kyiv just at the start of the summit, because Mr. Johnson's having a problem in the UK in trying to encourage people to follow him, as well as President Macron is already out in a limb in a way of having lost his political majority of sorts. So what is it that is going to bind the G7 together? Are we going to look at the immediate, that means drive Russia into the ground, or are we going to look at long-term perspective?
Maruf, look, at the end of the day, as they say, foreign policy is all domestic. So, that's a truism, and we don't need to debate that. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Biden, Mr. Putin's compulsions are different. But, this war has also shown some very sort of, let me say, sad aspects of the way international relations is conducted. Mr. Zelensky, if you don't mind my saying so, in various ways is portrayed as great, brave, etc. And I have no doubt about it. Wonderful. But, isn't he hoist on someone else's petard? I mean, that's a fact. Slowly but surely, his country is being beaten to pulp. And what is happening? A 46 million strong country, which was roughly in the nature of a middling European country in its lifestyle. 15 million refugees. What a state of play. Sad. Who are the ones who are actually bearing the brunt of this war? The Europeans, the Germans, the French, the Italians, and others. Now, let's also accept the fact that over the last 20-25 years, many of these European countries, particularly Germany, was coming out of the old shell of World War II. And in a sense, Europe was projecting its own position in the multipolar world. However, it didn't take long at all to be sort of boxed back. And whether we like it or not, at least as of now, while there are murmurings of dissent, people feeling the pinch, etc., but frankly, they are within the, let me say, the coat pockets of Washington, D.C. And it's they who are calling the shots. That also is something that we need to realize and understand. How it will turn out, I don't know. But in these countries, as you know, there is a large number of people who say that our destiny lies transatlantic. And of course, transatlantic means more than 50% of global GDP. They have commonalities of all kinds, etc. And that is not something that we sitting in India perhaps naturally understand. But that's the nature of the Western world, bound together in civilizational aspects, not just in terms of nation state aspects.
And if I might add, that's very well put, but if I might add, in geostrategic aspects, because the Americans have used this opportunity to emerge as the leaders once again of the Europeans and the Western world, purely because nothing brings countries together better than the threat of war or invasion or the possibility of economic growth. But economic growth they have, but it's the fear of Russia doing something to them that they can't handle. They've gone back to America. But that's veering us away from the G7 into a discussion on security. I want you to throw a bit more light on another issue, and that is energy, which has emerged now very clearly an issue of concern to the Europeans because their dependence on Russia has become a kind of counter-dependence in a way. And as also that the Western world, and particularly the energy partnerships that they are trying to forge, can only come at the cost of their disengagement from Russia, but also at the cost of eating into the resources in the Gulf, which was traditionally providing to countries like India and China, but now has to bear the burden of Europe too. Your call.
Maruf, you said it very well. And let me put this across like this. You know, the Europeans in their, let me say, quest at being a pole in a multipolar world, they did two things. One, they reached out to China, to huge benefits to themselves, of course, to benefits to China too. Secondly, Russia, an old adversary of continental Europe. They reached out to them. They built some kind of mutually beneficial relationships. Hydrocarbons is perhaps the best example of it.
Yes.
Now, the Europeans benefited by cheaper gas prices, cheaper energy availability, and so on and so forth. And, you know, when we talk of the climate debate, if you want to oust coal, then at least relatively oil and hydrocarbons is that much a better option. You know, talking about renewables, talking about nuclear is a completely different kettle of fish, and you're perhaps not there in terms of technology. But here was a situation which was allowing the Europeans to be themselves. The United States, on the other hand, has its own oil resources. It's a self-sufficient thing. And as you very rightly put, the major other exporters, the Middle East, were doing India, China, etc. Now what happens? They will be corralled without any doubt to first supply Europe, because that's part of the so-called overall overarching security scenario, help, allies, etc., whatever you will call. Global prices have already gone up from $60, $70 per barrel to $120. Gulf countries are writing off their deficits, feeling very comfortable, etc. All this is fine, but who is bearing the brunt of it? The Europeans and the large part of the world. The Africans, look at food situation, look at fertilizer. India too, are we really benefiting as a result of high oil price? We're having to scramble, whether it's Russia or anything else. The Chinese may be laughing, but it's only up to a point. If their basic markets, not just the United States, but elsewhere, starts taking a hit, it becomes a problematic case. So, these sanctions are great ideas, but smart as they may be, they can't remain smart over a long period of time, because ways get found and other things happen.
Okay, so I mean, that's again a good broadside on the sanction wallas, but more after a break to look at, apart from sanctions, what else is the G7 looking at doing to counter the autocracies of the world, but that after a break. Welcome back. We are continuing with Latitude, and we have the distinguished Ambassador Manjeev Puri with us, who in his very articulate and aggressive tenor is really giving us a reality check on what a summit like G7, which the Prime Minister attended, can actually hope to achieve, and where are its weak spots. And this is what brings me to the other question that I had for you, that India's presence, as you said in the first half, is extremely important, because with or without a physical presence of the Indian Prime Minister, the summit does try to engage with him virtually and otherwise. But here, Mr. Modi was there at the summit. He did have a lot of bilateral meetings with important heads of government, but he also made assertions to showcase that India, as a responsible global stakeholder, was hoping to achieve 40% of energy capacity in non-fossil fuels in 9 years before the given time span. And that, again, is good messaging, just like solar panels and messaging about alternate energy sources is. But is the world and is India going to be able to chug ahead without the oil resources that you were talking about before the break?
Maruf, you're absolutely right. Look, India and Prime Minister Modi have never hesitated to go the extra mile in terms of sustainability and sustainable development. Look at the Prime Minister's announcements at Glasgow. Many would say stretched India. But, it's a commitment of this country, its people, and its leadership. Now, look at what we are seeing in the Europeans. People are talking about even rolling back the cut down on fossil fuels. These are realities of life. How many countries, we are talking about stepping up our standards of living. Can you imagine a country being told, step down your standard of living? Do you think anyone is going to agree to that, no matter what the consequences? It's all very well to say ride bicycles, but nothing more than that. He made the point very vociferously, not only on behalf of India, but on behalf of the entire developing world, that look, the kind of sanctions and ideas that you've done, good, they make perhaps great sense for you, but please think of the rest of the world, and it is we who are part of those who contribute to a better globe, and therefore please have understanding and measure the impact of these particular things as to what they do to the world, because after all, what happens to our ecosystem will impact you also. And I think this message was clear. Let me also leave another thought with you. There is this whole business of India importing oil from Russia. And when you look at the figures, what the hydrocarbon imports from Europe, etc., are concerned, they are far more than what we are doing. And yet the pressures are all on us. Because why? They are coalesced together and we are kind of having to defend ourselves in their forum. But we need to do what is in our national interest. I think we are doing it well and rightly so.
Very well put. I completely agree with you. I think, this whole Western narrative that our way is the right way and will always be so. And if they were to bomb the hell out of Kosovo, as they did, there was nothing wrong with it. But when Russia, and I'm not defending the entire mess that Russia has made, but when Russia initially went in on calculations which they got wrong, their calculations were based also on the fact that the Western countries are really, in a way, echoing like hollow drums because they do not have a consistency in their ethical approach to conflict. Just war and the arguments notwithstanding. I want to also bring out another aspect, and which is, yes, Russia is now being targeted by everybody. But there was very clearly a set of broadsides aimed at China. China and the West wanting to wean itself away from dependence on China as a supply chain element, as well as Chinese products. But I think the biggest one was the initiative of $624 billion in $634 billion, if I stand corrected, to improve infrastructure in countries, of which apparently 100 billion or so would come to India also. Where do you see it coming? Where do you see these projects really giving a shot in the arm to India for having stood its ground against China's Belt and Road Initiative?
So, Maruf, without doubt, Russia was the main item on the menu at the G7 meeting, and that was obvious. But China was also a side dish, and for good reason. It couldn't have not have been on the menu. Now, you remember there was the Quad Summit only recently. So it's basically the same set of countries, the same set of thinking coming together and reinforcing the idea. Now, if Russia is the immediate thing, the realization that China and its hegemonistic ambitions and where it is going is now no longer a case of collaboration and competition, but one where you might have to do contestation. India is important. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, including its tentacles in Europe, have been talked about for years, but people always said the West did nothing. So they came up with this partnership, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, another partnership on the other side. All these things have come out. And yes, there are all these promises, but we need to see where they go. Incidentally, vis-a-vis India, they have earmarked a fair amount of money. We need infrastructure development, there's no doubt. We need development even in the area of sustainable development, etc. But if you notice, we have been somewhat circumspect in welcoming this infrastructure partnership because, we'd like to see what are all its minutiae. And sometimes what happens in Western countries, the minutiae have a number of sub-clauses which, tend to impinge on sovereign decision-making situations of other countries. And rightly so, we've said, well, let's have a look at it. But look, India is a democracy. India is a free country. India is a country where businesses also have a very important place in our ecosystem. And so, therefore, these cooperations are meaningful cooperations. And I hope we can take them forward to our benefit and the global benefit.
Great. And what I think I need you to give a little deeper insight into, while we are talking about Russia, while we're talking about China, we're talking of economics. Clearly, the sanctions that are there being imposed on Russia, my understanding is they haven't had the kind of effect that the West was hoping to cripple Russia into submission. And now the latest sanction, they say, is that they're going to cap any purchase of Russian gold for various purposes in the West. Likewise, Ukraine, which has become really the fall guy for everyone's ambition, has also run into a dire situation where, as you said, its way of life is threatened, but so is Ukraine's ability to supply Africa and the Middle East. Do you think anything came out in support of the African countries from the G7 except for very broad platitudes?
Maruf, they invited the African Union. The president of Senegal, who's the chairman, was there. I think the president of the chairperson, president of the African Union, she was also there. Look, why did they invite? So nobody would like to have opprobrium on themselves for such a global fallout. The West would like you to believe that what they are doing insofar as the Ukraine conflict is concerned is righteous and correct. Would they like that the blame for hunger, starvation in perhaps the most important political continent in the world, Africa, starts falling on their shoulders? You remember the president of Senegal went to Sochi and met President Putin. Now, what is the key problem with getting the Ukrainian grain out? One, the Russians are in the outer areas. They won't let ships go in. But the problem is the Ukrainians have mined the harbors like Odessa, etc. And their point is very simple. If we remove the mines, the Russians will move in. If they don't remove the mines, how are the ships going to go in? Now, of course, creative solutions can be found. Use a port on the side, this, that, and the other. But Maruf, when we are talking about the kind of large-scale movement, this is certainly not going to happen. And did we really see much? No, we really saw flag waving. And frankly speaking, the situation as far as the African countries, the UN itself saying so, is becoming more and more difficult. We will have to find solutions. The West's real power actually lies on being able to persuade the Ukrainians, persuade quote unquote. The Russians too would perhaps not like to be the victims, or let me say, tainted with opprobrium. Solutions can be found, but there has to be a willingness.
Well, thank you. I suppose they should, and maybe that might give Russia a half-decent chance to win back some respectability in global forums, that when it came to humanitarian issues, they went beyond their strategic ambitions. But that for another day. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for watching until our next episode. Goodbye.